We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No collusion!
Shit's get way too complicated for me.
Welcome to The Antedote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothkushel.
We're recording here Monday, February 8th, and this is the first time, barring we did a show with our friend John Brisson. We also did a test drive for our morning news show. This is the first time we've been able to do a long form actual recording since the inauguration and the introduction and the sitting of the new administration here in the U.S., the Biden administration. So this is our first recording since then, and we have a lot on our mind, a lot of thoughts about a lot of different matters. But right now, I think with this recording today, we're going to focus on a specific article that I think really gets to the heart of a lot of what we've been thinking and what we would like to try and convey certainly on like a foreign policy, geopolitical perspective. What we've had for like the last 4 years versus what has just come into office now, and some of our perspectives and takes on that. And so, Jeremy, would you like to introduce this article? And do you have any other comments you wanted to make beforehand?
Well, yes, in a certain way, this is about the fullest description that I've seen of the actual geopolitical consequences of the Trump administration. And so doing, then there's things suggested around the current Biden administration in terms of its weak spots as related to as Obama's weak spots. But it fleshes out the geopolitics of this in a way that was severely under, maybe even non-presented while this was all going on. And basically there was almost no discussion of this in the alternative media. There was mainly a spectrum of running cover for Trump and how bad the penetration and the attack on the United States actually was in relationship to Trump. And that's basically all you got at some level from the alternative media. And I would also say that this was one of our biggest challenges, and I think our analytical failures during the Trump years was to be very precise in terms of exposing the policy consequences that not only showed the major attack that the Trump 11/9 operation was, but also showing the reasons for it, thus adding more proof of the things that we did do really well during the Trump years, which was the analysis of the actual facts of the operation itself. And in that case, we don't talk about this a lot, but I would say we were some of the most accurate analysts in any of the media, alternative media and beyond, in terms of some of these key points about what Trump was, who he was. We were the ones who were continually dealing with Epstein, bringing Epstein into the mix, bringing the mega group into the mix well before the entirety of the Trump years, and putting it in a much larger context. We brought the mega group back up and put it on the table very early on in the process, well before Epstein was arrested. We analyzed the neocon split, which explained a lot in terms of the never Trumpers against Trump, but then this other more severe so-called neoconservative group that was supporting him, very tied into Israel, and some kind of very obvious relationship to some kind of ultimate, quote-unquote, multipolar advantage of some sort, which was related to the Trump administration. We explained the clean break paper, how it was playing out. We explained the Russia-American dynamics in relationship to the clean break dynamics in the Syrian conflict, so-called, the orchestrated civil war there, and how there was a good cop, bad cop dynamic being played out there. And so, we don't do a lot in terms of tooting our own horn, but we have the public analysis on the table that can be proven in terms of these areas. And that would include even to pointing out some of the key points that would ultimately prove out about the deep Russian cultivation of Trump. We were the ones who focused on these little tidbits of things like Sam Kislin and the TV store in terms of Trump. And I even speculate, and I imagine this will eventually prove out too, that those TVs were actually bugged, meaning that the whole idea of hotel rooms and people being bugged in hotel rooms goes way back in terms of the Trump-Russia story, and it actually involves the KGB electronics bugged in Trump hotel TVs in the 80s. So I just wanted to put that on the table while also acknowledging that this was really our weakest point, I think, was drawing out what were the actual consequences here, economically, geopolitically, in relationship to the 11/9 Trump attack on America.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I don't, it's not something I don't like to do, is like to toot my horn and all that, but you're right about some of the things we were identifying. I mean, we were identifying in the summer of 2018 the importance of Trump being cultivated and groomed by, Russian intelligence going back to the early 80s. And according to Craig Unger and his KGB, ex-KGB source on Narrative Live, that this was going on a few years before the 1987 meeting with the installation and the involvement of Semyon Kislin and Trump turning to him for his electronics in his burgeoning economic empire of properties, and then all of that eventually leading into the meeting set up by with the luncheon with the Russian ambassador and Leonard Lauder, the brother of Ronald Lauder, cultivating what led to the 1987 Moscow visit. And of course, we were on top. We were focusing on this in the summer, fall of 2018, back when Jimmy Dore and Aaron Maté were mocking people who wanted to talk about this. And it's just a stupid conspiracy theory. And then of course they went on to also insult a source that we've relied upon a lot for some of the best analysis out there from the long-term history of all this. Of course, the LaRouche PAC, before it went south, the Executive Intelligence Review, it went south with its shilling and apologetics for all the things it warned about over the decades. And of course, the people who basically tried to dance on Lyndon LaRouche's grave as some nutty fascist who just started the Trump-Russia conspiracy theory, when really what he did, his organization, not LaRouche himself, but his organization, was putting out probably still almost unmatched in terms of the best analysis and fact-based, evidence-backed reporting of not just the long-term aspects of Trump, but the long-term aspects of the bigger operation that ultimately brought Trump in from a domestic perspective and from a global geopolitical perspective. So.
And, at the same time, while the analysis of the EIR over those years was some of the best in terms of some of these issues, they were also the politics were deeply problematic in terms of some of the authoritarian bent. It was a bit of a political cult. And so those things are true. And in a similar fashion, the moves that someone like Obama made in relationship to, we'll get into it in this terms of this article, were also based on the neoliberal economics cult, which were basically totally put the United States into the compromised position of basically trying to quote unquote privatize the world. It's actually corporatized. And the actual American system, which is one of the things that whole milieu of the EIR and the LaRouche group focused on, the actual American system is much more indigenous and is not related to either this neoliberal approach to economics, or the sort of the historical Marxist approach. These are all actually European imports. The Austrian school is sort of the basis of some aspect of quote unquote privatization of neoliberal economics, and then obviously European Marxism as the basis of the left economics. And then even in the middle, you have Keynesianism, which is meant to be the compromised economic position. But meanwhile, there's an actual American economic tradition, which is very populist, but is also very principled, and fits in very much with the best of our political tradition in terms of the Bill of Rights as an implementation, a legal implementation of what I call the hierarchy of sovereignty, putting we, the people, above the government, from which then it draws all its legitimate powers to then protect the rights of the many. And then underneath that then are the corporations who get any legitimate power they have from their own state level based charters, where there is a do no evil clause, if not an actual public benefit charge, before you even need, benefit B Corps as they become known and developed today. The actual state level charters of corporations really are already meant to be benefit corporations, where if they don't serve the public benefit, the public welfare, then they're not allowed to have a state level charter. So what happened is that all of this got inverted, basically, and you have the corporations set at the top, obviously, with these small interlocking board of directors that makes it a transnational conspiracy with the legal protectorate of these corporate charters, basically, to make sure that no individual can ever be held accountable for what the corporations are doing. And then underneath that are the bought-off corrupt governments, including our own almost totally corrupted government at some level because of the system, not necessarily because of the people in it. And then underneath that, then we the people, with a lowercase w and p now, and we have become subjects to this inverted totalitarianism, as some might call it. So I just wanted to complicate that issue of the sourcing of these EIR articles, which brought in some of the information, but we're also focused on certain aspects, and that we went wide from the get-go and used them as only one of our sources in terms of how to talk about this larger situation. But it is the case, as you said, that there was obviously a turn there at some point. But let's get back into this article, if that's cool, Greg.
All right, yeah. Yes, and the last thing I'll say, this will be to finish up on this note, is I guess one of the things, you always refer, Jeremy, to the radical middle, and trying, finding this radical middle balance in terms of like and I think it applies here with this in terms of one area where I do want to try and where I think we do want to expand and try to broaden in terms of helping to shape and influence a conversation on, which is some sort of finding that radical middle between the excesses of the problems with the American, the corruption of, we're talking about the corruption of the American system, of our politics, of our institutions, and how that, I think, ultimately did lead to the Trump moment, and now seems to be perhaps what a Biden administration to some level or another reflects a return to after Trump. Some type of middle, that radical middle balance between that and the actual, and embracing as a result of this reactionary embracing from a lot of people of the actual hostile foreign elements that do seek to actually undermine and ultimately, I think, destroy the America that we know, and yes, in many cases do still love.
All right, so yes, let's go to this article written by Alfred McCoy, one of the most seminal sort of left-oriented academic critics of some of the deeper history of the American empire, and all of that. And so he has a key position, I think, to assess the post-Trump situation geopolitically from an American perspective. So this is at Tom Dispatch. titled Alfred McCoy, Rip Van Biden's America. And this is just a forenote to the article by Tom himself, from Tom Engelhardt. All right, so I'm going to read this. This was posted January 26, 2021. And this is Tom Engelhardt, I think. Quote, I'm 76 years old, so I have at least a modest feeling for what it must mean at the age of 78 to enter the White House to preside over a disturbed, deeply divided, and unnerved country. Speaking personally, considering just my own energy levels and the information that my still quite functional brain regularly tosses out, I think it should be illegal for anyone to become president at such an age. Yes, I have not the slightest doubt that Joe Biden, a decent man, will be a startling improvement over Donald Trump on issues from immigration to climate change to the pandemic. Given Trump's record, how could he not be? Honestly, just about anyone on this planet would have been. But no less honestly, the man who was a senator for 36 years, vice president from 2009 to 2017, and who's yearned to be this nation's leader since he first tried to run for that office in, take a breath here, 1987, should, in my opinion, be thought of as a, quote, used president, unquote, as in a used car. Sadly, perhaps it may be all too appropriate for just such a man, bringing into his administration a crew of retreads from the Obama era to preside over a country that now seems to have a used, if not used up, feeling to it. As Tom Dispatch regular and historian Alfred McCoy, author of In the Shadows of the American Century, suggests today, we already live in what's a distinctly fading imperial power, a place that's no longer the greatest, most indispensable nation on the face of the earth, and with such an aged president and now looks it too. In that sense, you might say that Joe Biden is just reality coming home. His very inauguration should have reminded us all that the disastrous forever wars the U.S. launched in the wake of the 9/11 attacks and that he once supported could never have truly stayed in distant lands across the planet. It should have surprised none of us that our new, quote-unquote, new president was inaugurated in what many have taken to calling a, quote, green zone, a term first used for the well-guarded part of central Baghdad, heavily fortified by the U.S. military after the occupation of Iraq started to go badly indeed. Inside just such an all-American version of that very zone in Washington, D.C., Biden was protected against his own people, a.k.a. the quote-unquote terrorists, by 25,000 National Guard troops. Meanwhile, the casualties from that other totally botched quote-unquote war of this moment, the one against COVID-19, have been rising precipitously to staggering levels in an America whose politicians once loved to call it the globe's truly quote-unquote exceptional country. Now it's exceptional for its pandemic cases and death rates. In short, none of this indicates that the United States, the former quote-unquote lone superpower on planet Earth, is in anything but increasingly poor shape. Let McCoy explain. Tom. Okay, and now on to the article titled, While America Was Sleeping, Waking from a 4-Year Fever Dream to Find Global Power Gone, by Alfred McCoy. Quote, after 4 years of Donald Trump's fitful tenure, America is wakening from a long troubled sleep to discover, like the fictional character Rip Van Winkle, that the world it once knew has changed beyond all recognition. In that classic American tale by Washington Irving, published in 1819, an amiable but shiftless farmer trolls out of his colonial village to go hunting in the Catskill Mountains. There he happens upon a group of mysterious men, drinks deep from their keg of liquor, and falls into a long sleep. He awakens to find that he's grown a white beard down to his belly, and his youth has withered into an unrecognizable old age. Walking back to the village, he discovers his wife is long dead and their house in ruins. Meanwhile, the sign above the village pub where he whiled away so many pleasant hours no longer bears the face of his beloved King George, the British monarch, but has been replaced by someone named General Washington. Inside the convivial chatter of colonial days has given way to fervid electioneering for something called Congress, whatever that might be. Incredibly, Rip Van Winkle had slept right through the American Revolution. While this country was similarly sleepwalking through the fever dream of President Donald Trump's version of America First, the world kept changing as decisively as it did during those 7 years when General Washington's Continentals fought the British Redcoats. Just as King George suffered a searing defeat that cost him the 13 colonies, so the United States has, with similarly stunning speed, now lost its leadership of the international community. Whose world island is it? Also, an aside, you almost could call it sort of all of these things are flipped in a way, right? Sort of the Donald Trump thing was seen as a populist revolt or a populist revolution. The counterpart to the Bernie Sanders political revolution from the left, this was seen as the populist political revolution upstart from the right. And I would almost say you could call it an anti-American revolution. And then this phrase of America First, it's almost, when you actually look at the consequences, it is similar, like America First in COVID death statistics, and America last in terms of world credibility.
Yeah, it's interesting because in the parallels he's making here, Rip Van Winkle awakens from the colonial system that he personally seemed to kind of have a fondness for, if not an approval, outright a fondness for, or certainly an approval of, to an unrecognizable place where this, the quote unquote populist American Revolution had completely changed the balance of everything that he had known before he woke up. And here, similarly, like people who got the for spoon-fed the Donald Trump populism. Let's remember, even the media, the anti-Trump media, and like the, even like, I think even some of the pseudo anti-Trump media, those who ultimately were portrayed as like the anti-Trump media, but ultimately were enabling this operation at just about every step of the way, also portrayed this as like some type of like actual populism. And that even, I think a lot of people who otherwise I think see through Trump still did see it as like some type of actual populism. But now people who might be, in the awakening from your slumber post-Trump, you're just starting people, seeing that like your country and like what it represents is completely unrecognizable from what it did before. And, there is that fact that a lot of people do look at this as a positive thing, but it also does come very much with the with its detriments, as we'll get into.
Yes, and the most that could be said about the Trump populism is that it weaponized populist sentiment, and when it actually came down to it, in terms of what could be reasonably called the stochastic seditious intent behind the January 6th operation, whatever it was in its fullness, that you see that, sure, you have these shock troops who are often they're, compromised individuals at some level, a lot of sort of drug stuff going on there, feds, the head of the Proud Boys, all of the, sort of compromised individuals. But in terms of right behind that, you just sort of see a whole layer of, of people who maybe were sort of had a fairly entitled lifestyle, you might say, and then COVID America hit them hard, and they basically decided to, take out their resentment on a specific group in their mind in the Congress.
Yes, and COVID is a major part of this, like waking up this unrecognizable, I guess, reality after all these years. But and one more thing to follow up on that is, yes, and that's something that we cannot forget, and we have to continue hammering home, especially in an attempted fervor. It seems like, that one of the things we worry about in the age of Biden is like this push to label, domestic terrorism push, and rather than actually acknowledging the reality and bringing to the reality like the truth about what took place and how the mind of the masses was manipulated in so many negative and detrimental ways, which would ultimately result in is like an owning up of like this, the corrupt elements of our system that paved the way for a moment for somebody like a Trump to rise to power. And that the people who got behind Trump had very, very real grievances about that were taken and manipulated and weaponized as you can see now at the rise of of QAnon and everything that's followed that, in the most ultimately detrimental and destructive ways possible. But there was at its root a lot of anger over very real issues that was completely just weaponized in the worst way possible. So.
And over again, you see that is one of the key self-reflective aspects that's necessary, while also totally being real and not in denial of the actual foreign aspect of the Trump attack on the United States, that it took advantage of, it utilized the serious weaknesses and vulnerabilities of the United States, which I would say is a combination of massive high-level corruption, and then also a corrupted, what I mean by corruption is, I mean by corruption of individuals, such as, the most obvious, something such as Epstein Maxwell in relationship to Trump, the Trump-Clinton bipartisan candidacy of 2016. Whichever way whichever way it quote unquote went, it was going to be an Epstein Maxwell compromised asset of some sort being put into the White House. So that's one aspect. But then also coupling that with the corruption of the system, the corruption of the political system and the American economic system, which has been a long-term operation here that ended up into the neoliberal economic order, which ultimately then was used to gut the United States economy in the late decades of the 20th century, and then present itself as the commanding heights for a few years of the new global war on terror, cyber surveillance economy, and the ultra financialization, Wall Streetification of the real economy, and the quants and all of that. And so it's interesting that the blowback of all of that comes in the form of someone like Robert Mercer, who represents, I think, the combination of those weak spots in relationship to our American situation. So I just wanted to point that out, that as we are real and clear-eyed about the transnational foreign attack aspect of the Trump aspect, it's very much like when you begin to focus on Russian hybrid warfare, that it really takes advantage of weak places, going all the way back to the question of civil rights and all of that.
And I do think between a combination of people like Alfred McCoy and some of the other people who we've identified in the past on the program, people like Sarah Kendzior, there is serious, like within the liberal academic institutions, there are people who do understand that, that do understand to some extent or another, the very real problems with our system, so to speak, and the corruption of our system that did help lead the way and pave the way for the moment of bringing Donald Trump to power. So
definitely. All right. So back to the article. Oh, one last thing that popped in my mind about that aspect, and as you were talking about the danger under the Biden administration of the escalation of the domestic war on terror, at the very least in terms of rhetoric, and then pushing towards policy stances and angles, that I think that is a crucial thing that we need to keep our eye on. And I would propose, and this is the way that I basically express my ultimate criticism of the alt-right in the early years of Trump, was I basically said that someone like Richard Spencer was anti-American. He had seditious intent because he basically was in bed with these hybrid warfare forces at the very least, because he wanted to undermine the American constitutional republic, which is not race-based, and replace it with a white nationalism or a white Zionism, I might repeat. So that I think that is one thing the way I do think that to shift the rhetoric from a question of domestic terrorism, then all rationality goes out the window, to the question of seditious intent, which all needs to be rooted out. And this is long-term stuff. And that way we can deal with the Richard Spencer type intent, which is working with these hybrid warfare types to try to the accelerationist aspect of trying to bring down the country. in that way to the much more longer term Henry Kissinger style high level seditious intent, which actually had to do with undermining these deeper political and economic American traditional systems. Okay, this section we are reading While America Was Sleeping by Alfred McCoy. Whose world island is it? Quote, during the 8 years before Donald Trump took office in 2017, the U.S. seemed to be adapting creatively to some serious challenges to its post-Cold War global hegemony. After the 2007-2008 financial crisis, was it generated? Yeah, I bet you. Okay, the worst since the Great Depression, a bipartisan stimulus program saved the nation's auto industry and launched a slow but sustained economic recovery. Fuel, and by the way, on this, you remember Biden's big statement during the Obama administration. Bin Laden is dead and General Motors is alive, and that sort of points to both the potential upside and the potential downside here in terms of it. And it's, obviously September 11th interpretations, the war on terror, understanding the deeper aspects, the geopolitical trap of all of that to some extent, then utilized to trigger global mass war crimes, in the midst of all of that, while also pointing out that the system was stabilized at some level too economically, and so it was an opportunity for it to be looted even further, which didn't happen at that point. Okay. Quote, fueled by renewed economic vitality, Washington seemed to have a reasonable shot at checking China's all too real and growing global economic challenge. After all, using the $4 trillion in foreign exchange reserves it had earned by 2014 from its new role as the world's workshop, Beijing had launched a $1 trillion Belt and Road initiative focused on making the vast Eurasian landmass and parts of Africa into an integrated trade zone, a veritable quote-unquote world island that would exclude America and so radically undercut its global leadership. In his 2 terms as president, Barack Obama, Trump's predecessor, who was, by the way, a Muslim, right? Muslim Brotherhood, right? Wasn't he? Obama? Yeah. Barack Obama, Trump's
Which
predecessor.
takes away from, as we've talked about before, and especially you've talked about before, takes away from the very real questions of like the actual issues with Obama's background, making it all into like him as like this the epitomization of like everything that America is fighting against in terms of its war on terror. So anyway.
Or as John McCain betrayed, no, he's not a Muslim, he's a nice man. Or that. And then as we've seen now, as we reported on the, what's it called? The open AI severely anti-Muslim bias of the totality of the global language, natural landscape, that basically where if you put it in there, 60% of all phrases coming from open AI at this time, based on the totality of the world's language, databases accessible to this AI, is I think the way it works, will include phrases about violence and then ultimately about terrorism. So the world landscape mind, really, if you think about language sphere, has been totally polluted by the September 11th and global war on terror operation, to the point where even, it's still praised by so-called liberals that John McCain, this was such a greater age when John McCain was bipartisan and said, no, he's not a Muslim, he's a nice man.
And also said bomb, 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 bomb Iran. So there you go.
And Adelson was so happy. All right. So, So in his 2 terms as president, Barack Obama, Trump's predecessor, pursued a clever countervailing strategy seeking to split Beijing's potential world island economically at its continental divide in the Ural Mountains. Obama's planned Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, which pointedly excluded China, was the keystone to his strategy for drawing Asia's trade towards America, thereby rendering that Belt and Road Initiative a hollow shell. That draft treaty, which would have surpassed any other economic alliance except the European Union, was designed to integrate the economies of 12 Pacific Basin nations that generated 40% of gross world product, and the U.S. was to be at the very heart of it. To drain commerce away from the other half of Beijing's would-be world island, Obama was also pursuing negotiations for a transatlantic trade and investment partnership with the European Union. Its combined $18 trillion economy was already the world's largest, accounting for 20% of gross world product. The proposed regulatory alignment between Europe and the United States would supposedly have added $260 billion to their total annual trade. Obama's bold grand strategy was to use those two pacts to beggar Beijing's plans by giving the U.S. preferential access to 60% of the world economy. Of course, Obama's effort was encountering strong headwinds even before he left office. In Europe, an opposition coalition of 170 civil society groups protested that the treaty would transfer control over the regulation of consumer safety, the environment, and labor from democratic states to closed corporate arbitration tribunals. In the U.S., Obama's scheme faced sharp criticism even within the Democratic Party. Key figures like Senator Elizabeth Warren opposed the potential degradation of labor and environmental laws via the TPP. In the face of such strong criticism, Obama had to rely on Republican votes to win Senate approval for fast-track authority to complete the final round of negotiations over the treaty. That opposition, however, ensured that neither agreement would be approved before he left office. It was, however, Donald Trump who delivered the coup de grace. Right after his inauguration, he curtailed trade talks with Europe and withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, saying, quote, "We're going to stop the ridiculous trade deals that have taken companies out of our country, and it's going to be reversed," unquote. Okay, so this is interesting here. I just want to point out that this also does expose once again the weak parts of this neoliberal Washington consensus of some sort, and what Obama was working on. In that, if he'd been able to actually bring in the legitimate criticism of just extending the American corporate neoliberal approach to this very important geopolitical maneuver, he probably would have actually been able to accomplish it. And this is paralleled by the obvious issue with we're going to look forward, not backwards. And that includes, which wasn't even talked about, looking back at 9/11 about who did it and why, and not only about the torture. And then also we should have had, even the British had a serious inquiry into their origins in the Iraq war. And I don't believe the United States has even had a serious public inquiry into the origins of the Iraq war here. And so that I would point out that was a fatal flaw, a weakness of the Obama approach here. But it's more nuanced than just Obama's an evil American imperialist.
Yeah, and it's also interesting bringing in Europe with relation to in addition to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the transatlantic trade and the TTIP partnership with the European Union, which was also on the table. And so you have, as a result of that, I mean, you get the counter push to that, which was seen as like the evils of like Western neoliberal global Western neoliberal globalism. Of course, I guess the antidote to that, so to speak, to play on our own term, would be the Brexit deal and all that brought about, and that was hailed as like the saving Britain and maybe even the West from the hegemony of like the Western elitist monolith. When in reality, that was such a Brexit was the key move pre-Trump that there were blows before that, but that was the big blow, which was like the primary major blow before Trump came in, is bringing in like the splitting of Britain away from this as a result of all these moves. And one more thing I would add here also is that the concerns, and this is once again I think the drawbacks of like the neoliberalism aspect of things, is that I do think that the very real concerns regarding like the treatment of workers and environmental the lack of environmental concerns and standards being taken into consideration were very, very likely very, very real concerns that did undermine this from a very legitimate aspect as well. And I think a lot of that goes back to this spirit of like of quote unquote American neoliberalism, business, and the pitfalls that come with that. So,
yes, the American corporatist angle that really was escalated under the rubric of the Cold War, ultimately, and I'm glad you point out this European centrality of these deals, because it was very early, often talked about the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Trans-Pacific Partnership. There's also the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP,
which was not focused on almost at all in terms of. I remember it being talked about under Obama, but then once you get to transition to Trump, I don't remember. I remember a lot of talk about NAFTA and the TPP, but not the TPIP. And so that's interesting. And we've addressed the more political aspect that became obvious around the alliance, most obviously of the highest levels of the Russian government with the highest levels of the Israeli government, in terms of most especially Putin and Netanyahu, in relationship to the undermining of the European political sphere, most obviously with something like Brexit. But we did not take into account this question of China in relationship to the economic implications of that, because of course these legitimate and very serious criticisms that should have been fully incorporated if you wanted to get to actual, I would say, moral and productive American leadership and economically in terms of these kinds of deals, they were never even incorporated. But if it were presented as what is the lesser evil, as a choice between the lesser evils, like we're given in terms of our elections, between the neoliberal economic order of the United States, where at least there's this discussion of labor rights and environmental stuff, and or the Chinese government approach to it, then you could have sort of seen much more of a distinction there, and that was never brought into the fold. Do you want the more of the American leadership, or do you want more of the Chinese leadership? So people weren't ever really given a choice in the matter as such.
And this article is going to get more into the bringing the European Union into with regards to its own dealings with China during the Trump administration. So there's more talk about this down the road. But I mean, it is important to point out, like, I think the hawkishness towards China from like this from the MAGA crew here in America regarding like all the CCP and the Belt Road Initiative and trying to take over the world and in bed with the American the rot of our corrupt politicians and all this, when in reality, like, I think you can automatically look at the undermining of, for better or for worse, the undermining of something such as this TTIP, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which would have strengthened the European Union to the tune of adding $260 billion to its total annual trade. And as a result of that, China comes in and takes advantage of the void left behind by making deals and by coming in and making more dealings with the European Union and its countries. And so that's instead, like, that is just simply portrayed by like this class of MAGA people as the more business as usual. But ultimately, it looks like to me it's just China to be able to come in and basically exploit the situation by coming in and doing its own dealings with these countries as a result of it. So.
And the next section here is titled Unilateral Foreign Policy. And I would just point out one last thing, is that another, I would say, weakness of the Obama policy was sort of creating a new, an economic kind of Cold War with China rather than just asserting American leadership while then opening a door to China to participate to actually extend American leadership while including China. And so I think that was, part of the issue there. But, I'm sure that's arguable. Okay. Back to the article While America Was Sleeping by Alfred W. McCoy. Quote, unilateral foreign policy. Trump would instead adopt a unilateral America First strategy that soon sparked a costly trade war with China. After 2 years of escalating tariffs on both sides of the Pacific that damaged the U.S. economy, Trump capitulated in January 2020, signing an agreement that rescinded the most prohibitive U.S. duties in exchange for Beijing's unenforceable promise to buy more American goods. The president then hailed his, quote, big, beautiful, unquote, trade deal as a great victory, even though it was nothing less than an ill-concealed surrender. While his White House seemed obsessed with gaming its bilateral ties with China, Beijing was stealing a page right out of Obama's strategic global playbook, outmaneuvering Washington by pursuing 2 multilateral trade agreements that should have seemed eerily familiar to anyone who lived through the Obama years. In November 2020, Beijing would lead 15 Asia-Pacific nations in signing a regional comprehensive economic partnership that promised to create the world's largest free trade zone, encompassing 2.2 billion people and nearly a third of the global economy. Just a month later, China's President Xi Jinping scored what one expert called a, quote, geopolitical coup, unquote, by signing a landmark agreement with European Union leaders for the closer integration of their financial services. In effect, the accord gives European banks easier access to the Chinese market while drawing the continent more closely into Beijing's orbit. So serious is the shift away from Washington that President Biden's incoming national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, publicly urged the NATO allies to first consult with the new administration before signing on to the deal, a plea they simply ignored. Indeed, this treaty is arguably the biggest breach in the NATO alliance since that mutual defense pact was formed more than 70 years ago. And an aside here, there's a picture of the cover of McCoy's book titled In the Shadows of the American Century, The Rise and Decline of U.S. Global Power, which is, we won't go into this now, but this is another area of deeper inquiry about the project for a new American century, the role of the paleo neocons in relationship to the support of the war on terror, the 9/11 fraudulent mythology, and then as it expanded into the clean break wars, including Iraq and all of that, and how, as was really easily seen, that ended up in not actually advancing an American position really of any sort, whether actual economic positioning in the Middle East, and definitely not diplomatic or geopolitical legitimacy or credibility, and basically just a highly legitimate what the liberals would call a moral stain on the perception of the world against our mass criminality. So, back to the article While America Was Sleeping by Alfred McCoy. Quote, through a stunning inversion of Obama's bold yet unrealized geopolitical gambit of using multilateral pacts to draw Eurasia's trade toward America, those 2 agreements will give China preferential access to nearly half of all world trade, without even factoring in the still developing Belt and Road project. In a diplomatic masterstroke, Beijing exploited Trump's absence from the international arena to negotiate agreements that could, along with that Belt Road initiative, steer a growing share of the Eurasian continent's capital and commerce toward China. In the years to come, Beijing's inclusiveness could well mean Washington's exclusion from much of the burgeoning trade that will continue to make Eurasia the epicenter of global economics. The decline and fall of you-know-which great power. If that were all, then we could chalk up a few significant wins for China and just wait for Biden's foreign policy team to try to even the score. But there's far more happening that suggests those treaties were a clear manifestation of deeper, more troubling trends.
And by the way, this what was just covered there in those previous paragraphs is, I think, the maybe the best brief summarization I've seen yet of exactly the consequences of the decline of, as we've called it, like, quote, American global leadership, which, once again we iterate, is not our ideal example of what like actual like American principled global leadership or whatever you want to call it would look like. But nonetheless, it being something that was designed to keep like America, as opposed to like these hostile foreign entities that came under Trump, an actual like American actual hegemony that's working to the best interest of like this particular of like actually implementing and maintaining like American and Western systems that some semblance or another. And the fact that they're being completely like the Biden administration, this is like the very real consequences people talk about of like of like China coming in and doing all this business with these European countries. Is that now it's very interesting because like the EU is this big conglomerate of countries, but ultimately like a lot of these countries, I think what I would imagine like we're looking for, like perhaps some of the leaders are looking to cash in on the best deals possible. And in this case, like, this is the place to go. And like the Americans are no longer, they no longer even look to, or even, it seems, according to this article, even like just really even consider like the Americans on these matters anymore. It's just completely going past like any type of like American Western, the traditional institutions, and just completely moving in to do business with this. As you're talking about, people better damn well consider the negatives as opposed to the looking approvingly at like American decline of American global leadership, but also better damn well look at like the potential negatives of what you were laying out earlier in terms of like conversations about even being able to have conversations about the nature of like of labor standards and practices and all that vis-a-vis this new force that's coming in that is where the Americans looks like is if Jake Sullivan is to be believed, the not even listening to Jake Sullivan as he asks like these countries to consult with us before getting into these dealings, and they're not even. It does seem like it was a major consequence that a lot of these foreign policy professionals talked about in terms of like the consequence to Trump is that in a lot of cases, America, it seems, increasingly does not have a seat at the table anymore, and people better think about the just rather than just like celebrate and dance on like the grave of like American corrupt American global power, like you better consider that not every consequence of this is just automatically a positive one. So
yeah, and you might even point out too that even in the alternative aspects of the media that have been focused on the question of the dangers of multipolarism, Russia, Israel, China, Israel, all of that, Belt Road Initiative. They never pointed out this issue of what Obama was doing. So I think that's also pretty damning of that aspect of the alternative media, too. All right. Back to the article, While America Was Sleeping, by Alfred McCoy. The decline and fall of you-know-which great power. If that were all, then we could chalk up a few significant wins for China and just wait for Biden's foreign policy team to try to even the score. But there's far more happening that suggests those treaties were a clear manifestation of deeper, more troubling trends. When empires decline and fall, they seldom collapse in the sort of sudden apocalypse portrayed in a monumental series of paintings entitled, quote, The Course of Empire, by another denizen of the Catskill Mountains, the renowned artist Thomas Cole. His 1983 painting in that series, now appropriately enough hung at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, shows a quote-unquote savage enemy plundering a grand imperial capital whose inhabitants, debased by years of luxurious living, can only flee in terror while women are raped and buildings burn. And there's a picture of it.
Storm. That was 1836, by the way.
Yes. Thomas Cole, The Course of Empire, Destruction. Back to the article. Quote, empires, however, usually experience a long, less dramatic decline before they fall in the Roman fashion. thanks to events whose logic only becomes apparent years or even decades later, as historians try to sort through the rubble. So it's likely to be in what, until mid-last week, was, and still in many ways remains, Donald Trump's America, where the signs of decline are as erratic as they are omnipresent. The most telling harbinger of that decline, Trump himself, is now in exile at his Mar-a-Lago club in Florida. 10 years ago, in an essay for Tom Dispatch entitled, quote, 4 Scenarios for the End of the American Century by 2025, unquote, I suggested that U.S. global hegemony would end not with Thomas Cole's apocalyptic bang, but instead with the whimper of empty populist rhetoric. Quote, riding a political tide of disillusionment and despair, unquote, I wrote in December 2010, quote, a far-right patriot captures the presidency with thundering rhetoric, demanding respect for American authority and threatening military retaliation or economic reprisal. The world pays next to no attention as the American century ends in silence, unquote. Trump's election in 2016 made all too real what, until then, had only seemed to me a troubling possibility. With a legerdemain worthy of, I don't know what that word means. With a legerdemain worthy of the 19th century showman, P.T. Barnum's Bag of Bunkum, like the supposed Cardiff Giant or the Fiji Island Mermaid, Trump's TV show The Apprentice presented the Donald. Remember also the Reddit thread, the big Reddit thread. It was wasn't it the Donald?
Yes, it was. By the way, legerdemain appears to be a noun to describe deception or trickery. So,
oh, thank you so much, Greg, for looking that up. That's an interesting legerdemain. Legerdemain. That's a cool word. Okay. All right. So Trump's TV show, The Apprentice, presented the Donald, all capitalized, as a self-made billionaire of extraordinary financial savvy. Who better to The Secret of the Deal? What was the name of the book, Greg? The
Art of the Deal.
The Art of the Deal, right. Back to the article. Quote, who better to rescue America from the job losses, stagnant wages, and foreign competition brought on by economic globalization? But Trump had cheated his way into an Ivy League college. Many of his businesses had gone bankrupt, and his much vaunted entrepreneurial flair came down essentially to frittering away a $400 million inheritance from his father. As journalist H.L. Mencken predicted back in 1920, America had finally come to the point where, quote, the plain folks of the land will reach their heart's desire at last, and the White House will be adorned by a downright moron, unquote.
Ouch, ouch. But I mean, at its most basic ways, outside of like the, unfortunately, a lot of people have very, very real fallen for like Trump is like this chess playing genius or whatever. But I mean, at its root, I do think that's what that is largely what America got with Donald Trump. But at the end of the day, so.
Well, what's so interesting about this too is that this, of course, is where the whole side you could insert both of Craig Unger's books right here as a footnote to explain how this was what this actually was. That this was actually, the background of Trump being developed as an asset of the Russian deep state, i.e. the Red Mafia, i.e. the aspects of the Kosher Nostra that link up with the post-Soviet landscape in terms of the oligarchs in New York City and down to Florida and all of that. And in Unger's newest book, American Compromat, in one of his key sources, who I don't believe he actually gets the basics from, but he basically uses the source Schwitz. Is that what's his name? The name of the colonel that Schwetz.
Yuri Schwetz.
Yuri Schwetz. That we covered during the Trump years the way that counterintelligence assesses whether someone is a cultivatable asset. How cultivatable are they as an asset with the acronym MICE, M-I-C-E, where money, M is for money, I is for, which one is, ideology. I is for ideology. And so that's like if someone, in terms of the Soviet sphere, whether someone's leftist has a or is an anti-American imperialist, that kind of stuff, ideology. And we pointed out that this was the only category where Trump didn't seem to, there's no ideology present there.
Right. Money. Like. Yeah, go ahead.
And then C, compromise or compromat, right, with the K, which is Unger's book is titled American Compromat, where that could be, in the case of Donald Trump, both forms of major compromise, which would be, one would be economic chains in terms of the money laundering through the Trump properties for many, many years, or even the higher level aspect of that of the Deutsche Bank asset of what was called the Russian laundromat in terms of a high level banking operations interface with Donald Trump. As we pointed out, too, it looked like that was right on the surface in terms of the son of the retiring Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy. You must be so proud of him, Justin Kennedy, and the strange whisper of Trump to Kennedy after an announcement, and Kennedy looks at him all strangely. And that whole background there was so obvious at some level. And Justin Kennedy working at Deutsche Bank in some of these areas where Trump had interfaced, in terms of that being the only bank apparently that was operating in an American context that would continue extending credit to Donald Trump after a certain period of time. And even then, towards the end of his presidency, they ultimately pulled the plug there. So he is a spent asset of some sort. And then E for ego. And this is where I want to make the point about where McCoy quotes Mencken, H.L. Mencken, saying that the plain folks of the land will reach their heart's desire at last, and the White House will be adorned by a downright moron, unquote. That E is for ego. And remember, there was a playing to the egotism of this aspect of the right, actually, and where the Donald, everywhere from the Donald to the Q and all of that the way that Trump was we played on this too, like in terms of like we were always making fun of it as the 4D chess, and Trump is a chess master and Trump is a hidden genius and all this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so when it comes down to it, when Schwetz was brought on to the Narrative podcast by Unger, and Zev Shalev asked Schwetz how good of a cultivatable asset was Donald Trump by the KGB in these years. And he basically said he's just so extreme, his personality. He was one of the best cultivatable aspects, most especially because of his low IQ. And I think the combination of those points actually sort of points out about the whole punk operation on the United States that was actually run as a high-level, severe hybrid warfare operation, but where, like, you know, these dupes, these very largely dupes on the right, had their egos assuaged at a mass level about this guy, the God Emperor they were worshiping was some kind of hidden genius, whereas he was identified by KGB, intelligence veteran as low IQ.
To take advantage of and manipulate the sensing and the feeling by many conservative-leaning Americans, largely cultivated and encouraged by the likes of Rush Limbaugh, some of the people who you've been here in the Midwest have been writing, and we'll have to talk about this in the future. Some of the people who have been very, I think, accurately pointing out what's been done to a large portion of the minds of the Midwestern conservative American by talk radio, by the rise of Fox News, by the rise of this entire conservative media complex, and basically exploiting the inherent, in many cases, subconscious prejudices and bias and vulnerabilities of the American, the conservative American Midwestern majority, of the feeling of losing your country and all this, and the things that, like these Russian active measures we've talked about, have taken advantage of, these matters, these issues that have been that are both real and have been exacerbated and exaggerated and Trump comes into play on the fears and the vulnerabilities and the subconscious biases and prejudices of this now vulnerable sector of the American population. It feels like it's losing the country they once knew. And really all Donald Trump is doing, really, at the end of the day, is a false appeal to this sense of Americana that the conservative American believes, they've been led to believe by and large by media that they're losing. Like, it's not that Trump somehow is going to bring us back to the America we once knew and loved. And that's really, I think, at the heart of this. And you can bring in, I guess, an absolute moron to exploit that assessment of people and exploit those feelings. So
that's a very good point, Greg, because it needs to be seen looking back that Fox News was not just some kind of emanation of some kind of indigenous American reactionary culture, although it took advantage of that, sort of like you said. But really, Fox News can be seen as another piece, and a severe and crucial piece in terms of the apparently first foreign-owned major media network in the United States, as a foreign hybrid warfare operation that totally corrupted the political values of, like you pointed out, with a focus on the Midwest. And there's a woman who's running, I think, for Congress in Missouri, or maybe trying to run for Senate against Hawley, who comes from who grew up on a farm in Missouri, who basically describes very precisely what she saw as the destruction of the much more moderate and humble aspects of real Midwestern political culture, which I'm aware of just in sort of living in Kansas and even in Lawrence, but sort of feeling out different parts of Kansas. You can understand there is a certain the possibilities actually of a radical middle, I would call it radical moderate approach to American politics that it's expressed in the Midwest. That Fox News totally undermined, and that she basically described it happening to her friends and family over a long term in a similar kind of way that we saw Facebook and Trump, MAGA, and Q kind of memes take over the minds of some of our what should have been our intellectual elders in these last years.
By the way, I believe you're referring to Lindsey Simmons. And Lindsey Simmons, she's on Twitter at Lynn's for Congress, LYNZ for Congress. And, you and I, we've personally picked up on a few areas where, this isn't the most, in some ways, she's not a most ideal congressional candidate, for example, some aspects of her philosophy and policy. But, I mean, she was very serious, and I believe very accurate in her assessment of what's happened to the Midwestern mind from this uniquely Midwestern perspective. And she actually ran, it looks like, in the district that's represented just south of the Kansas City area, the 4th district, and lost to the Republican incumbent there. So.
That's interesting. And what's interesting, too, is she and another sort of fairly, more upstart Democratic candidate in Missouri exposed that the Democratic Party of Missouri was closing down some of their meetings that have historically been totally public and not allowing people like them to attend them. So there's another issue there where, in relationship to what we have been pointing out the whole time in terms of the bipartisan, transpartisan political corruption, that the political parties are ultimately, at this point in American history, they are just extensions of mob politics, really. They are basically mobs. They're political mobs, organized crime syndicates themselves. And so and always what is put forth is we need to start a new party. No, even the best of the founders' political framework saw deep suspicion. With this deep suspicion, the rise of political parties themselves. Okay, and so that's what I would articulate, that a real American political upstart movement that was going to reform and create a real American a renaissance across the entire board, politically, economically, ecologically, creatively, and culturally, and all of that, is not going to take it's not going to take the form of a new political party, a third political party. No, it's going to take the form of a transpartisan, an anti-partisan maybe, but anti-partisan in principle, but transpartisan in terms of coalition, a set of principles, political ethics and practices, and then a We the People platform that then people, wherever they are in the political landscape, they can inhabit even any of these corrupt parties across the board. They can then join in and that its leadership through proposal and principle and moral and creative vision, rather than we need to start a new corrupt party. No. Okay. So I just wanted to point that out. But I'm so glad that you pointed out this question of that this goes way back, Greg, to that something like Fox News and those airwaves really, they created the ground, the scorched earth political policy to create the ground for the Trump MAGA seats to take hold ultimately. And that's crucial. And then finally, I would point out that even people who are quote unquote high IQ, and I think that's actually true, like people such as like from the alternative media, like people like Ryan Dawson, they were themselves part of the cultivation of the low IQ moron Trump and selling him as some kind of true outsider who was a political genius. And he played the role of a political genius as an actor, as a bad schlocky reality TV show actor.
Very stable genius.
The most stable genius ever.
Yeah.
Everybody's saying it, including Ryan Dawson.
The little stupid stunt he did of his cognitive abilities with Chris Wallace. I mean, just whatever. But I mean, it's been aided and enabled and abetted. And I'll add the last thing that, people like to talk about, like the media is like the corporate media or the Zionist media or whatever. And there's truth to all those things. But ultimately, I look at a lot of your big media bosses, and this is where the Hollywood connection comes in with Trump, is ultimately, it's an extension of this same bigger organized crime, intersection of business and organized crime, ultimately that Donald Trump at its deepest core represents. So,
very much so. All right. Back to the article here. The article, While America Was Sleeping, by Alfred McCoy. Quote, once in office, Trump soon bent the nation, but not the world, to his will. Rupturing time-tested alliances, tearing up treaties, denying incontrovertible climate science, and demanding respect for American authority with a thundering, if largely empty, rhetoric that threatened military retaliation or economic reprisals globally. Despite his manifestly inane policies, the Republican Party capitulated, corporate tycoons applauded, and nearly half the American public cleaved to their newfound savior. As with all sellout shows, the best was saved for last. The best was still to come. What was their thing that they kept saying? The best is still to come. That was their phrase for the second Trump administration, actually.
Right.
Back to the article. Quote, when the COVID-19 pandemic struck with full force in March 2020, 3/11/20, right? Trump turned up at the Centers for Disease Control, CDC, in Atlanta, donning a MAGA hat to proclaim his quote-unquote natural ability when it came to medical science, while distinguished doctors stood by like studio extras in mute testimony to his otherwise risible claims. As the pandemic began climbing towards its terrible, still-developing toll, Trump hijacked White House briefings by medical experts to promote a succession of crackpot claims. Wearing a mask was merely, quote, politically correct, unquote. And an aside there, of course, was that, this series will also probably show the weakness of the establishment liberal perspective on this, because, of course, it was the head of the CDC and even Fauci himself who were discouraging mask use when even after it became clear that this was a highly aerosolized virus, where masks were an obvious tool in some kind of toolkit in knocking down some aspect of transition. And it was really the totality of the establishment media that was in line with this, and not just Trump, really. But Trump politicized what I would call the dangerous disinformation that's being pointed out here. All right. Mask was merely, quote unquote, politically correct. COVID-19 was just another flu that, quote, becomes weaker with warmer weather, unquote. And aside here that, this was another point where Trump was pointing to some aspect of the truth here, which again, the quote unquote establishment trust the scientisms pieces have still not publicly admitted, in terms of now the almost overwhelming evidence that the question of vitamin D in relationship to the human body, created endogenously by exposure to the sun, has a deep role in not only the body's ability to fight off COVID, SARS-CoV-2, but also probably in relationship to most all pandemics that involve at the very least, anything involving the lungs. And so this is another, this is an interesting place. I'm not going to go into all of this, but I think in every one of these cases around COVID-19, it can be shown where the result, the negative result of the Trump approach to COVID-19 was backed up by these high-level corruption represented by the American establishment, including its public health authorities and all of that. Okay, then and by the way, too, the warmer weather thing, it's actually COVID is outside is much less spread when people are outside. It's a very much an inside spreader. Doesn't mean it can't be spread outside, but that's very obvious. It seems to degrade very fast in any exposure to the sun as a virus itself. Okay. Hydroxychloroquine was a cure. And aside, of course, this was, this before this whole sphere was polluted by the Trump sphere and Rudy Giuliani interviewing Dr. Zelenko and all of this. This was being pointed out by serious doctors that zinc and zinc ionophores were very powerful preventative if caught early on in potential viral infection, including SARS-CoV-2. And then, of course, this got super politicized in hydroxychloroquine as the silver bullet or something like that. All right. Quote, and shining ultraviolet, quote, light inside of the body, unquote. Or that was sort of funny, actually. I mean, I'm sure there's some science behind that too, all right. Or injecting, quote, disinfectant, unquote, were possible treatments. And aside, this, of course, is where we pointed out, too, that similarly to the way that the liberal media was used to create a clown out of George W. Bush as the 9/11 wars were being expanded, the torture regime was being cemented in the political system, the Homeland Security surveillance state was being built up, but they could laugh at the clown George W. Bush. Something very similar was done in relationship to Trump with the mass humor and the tweet memes, rather than a deep, serious public exposure of the 11/9 operation itself and who all its foreign partners were.
And what it did, and people, as we talk about some of the aforementioned people we talked about before, Sarah Kinsey or people in her milieu have pointed out, like, this was a almost deliberate normalizing of Trump. And as you talk about the 11/9 operation and this is what Trump masterminded in, was like the media in terms of like the coverage of him, like turning any type of coverage into a positive. And so while it appears like the media hates him so much because they're always mocking and ridiculing him, this actually plays into the hands of both Trump and the people behind him by just making everything out to be just a circus around him and the incompetency of the administration. I believe Sarah Kinsey's expression is they hide malice with incompetence, and you can see that at play where it's just like everything just becomes a running gag joke. Oh, what did Trump tweet today? And sometimes it is kind of funny, and sometimes sometimes it's easy to get drawn into that stuff. But ultimately, what it does is it's its own way of normalizing this thing, and it almost allows people to let their guards down as to like while these very, very serious consequences are going on, people are still just using everything to make fun of what he did, what he just did, or what he's going to do next, or Donald Trump told people to inject bleach, which it just makes it into just like a laughing stock and a big joke.
Exactly, and it puts the capstone on this as a reality TV show rather than the reality of a takedown of your country. And so it turns Donald Trump into the guy on the reality TV show that the liberals can laugh at, basically, rather than deal with the reality of the situation and how deep the history is in terms of how the ground was prepared for this to happen. And then finally, I think it's also the idea of hyper-normalization in terms of the Russian context as a political theater, that there's a certain amount of hyper-visualization related to the American context that we've been starting to touch upon, about sort of partially why some of our analysis has been beyond, our lack of production values and professionalism and writing and all of that, which not making excuses for that as we begin to talk about working on that. But in terms of the oral tradition that that's what the antidote is. We talk, you and I, Greg, we talk on recordings. Then we talk between recordings, and we use the ancient oral tradition of conversation to begin to propose an analysis based on fact-based evidence with an attention to written material. But then the digestion of the written material is done in oral form, basically. And we pointed out that because of our weaknesses, we didn't get totally into video production and tons of live streaming video. And it's mainly just you and me talking, Greg, on audio. That in the midst of all of that, I don't think it's a coincidence that a radio, an online radio or podcast show like ours was largely oral in its tradition and not about YouTube video and all of that, was one of the ones that got the most right in terms of an analysis. But it also points to why some of our points were glossed over because of the hypervisualization of our culture. But what I think I have some hope here is that there's a return to the valuing and the understanding of this conversational oral tradition. And I just wanted, on an aside, I just wanted to point out that there's this rise of the app Clubhouse, which is very interesting because it's all about oral assemblies in live time. And over the weekend, there was this Solar Winds cyber warfare room that went on for the entire weekend, and they allowed me to come in and make a few of my own statements. I dealt with TheAntedote, explained TheAntedote, talked about Pollard, the backdoor of Israel to Russia, dealt with the background of the psychographical psychometrical warfare behind Cambridge Analytica, SEL, and the targeting of the dark triad and all of that. And this, and a lot of people were saying there's some very serious people who were part of this seminar, what became ultimately a global seminar in live time that was there was so much openness to discuss. I got fact checked by a lawyer about my take on Pruneyard case law in California. The thing is started by guys who have a background in as Marines, I think, Marine intelligence kind of guys, and people who are into serious cyber positions and all of that. And so this is becoming there's an understanding, there's an indigenous understanding, not only in the United States, I think, but around the world. There was actually Chinese nationals who were asking about how to protect themselves. I just saw even this morning that China has already moved to shut down. It looks like shut down access to Clubhouse. But my point is that there is part of the natural body political immune response to this ongoing long-term hybrid warfare that I believe in an American context is hyper visually orchestrated, is a return to these really root aspects of not making YouTube videos with flashy graphics and sort of, scary music and all of that, but talking long-term, factually, seriously, dialogically, with debate and critique and all of that, while being open, a return to that kind of really sort of ancient human, hunter-gatherers around a fire discussing what to do about the threats that the tribe faced. There's a lot of possibility here, I think, suggested that this feels so good to people to be able to get in a digital room together in live time and talk to long extended conversations about the most serious matters of the time in a way that is highly nuanced. And that's what we saw, the rise of meme visual crap culture, which was actually drove the whole Trump era in terms of Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and all of that. And so a return to the oral commons, that's what I think there's a lot of possibility there. So sorry about that extended rip, but there was just a very interesting and compelling experience in relationship to that SolarWinds cyber warfare clubhouse room over this weekend. Sorry, Greg.
No, I'm glad you brought it up. It's definitely something to utilize and to potentially take advantage of. And so it's thank you for bringing that up and for bringing it to my attention.
All right, so back to the article, While America Was Sleeping by Alfred McCoy. Quote, a surprising number of Americans started drinking bleach to protect themselves from the virus, forcing months of public warnings. Did they really? How many people actually started drinking bleach? I mean,
that sounds like it may have been
sounds like a talking point, but all right, we'll keep going here. After nearly a century in which the United States had been a world leader in promoting public health, the Trump administration, to escape blame for its own escalating failures, walked out of the World Health Organization, lending the country the aura of a failed state. The CDC itself, once the world's gold standard in medical research, bungled the development of a coronavirus test and so forfeited any serious nationwide attempt to successfully track and trace the disease, the most effective means of its control. Okay, and aside here, this is obviously related to where we're saying that there's a breakdown of the best of these kind of progressive, liberal, critical political spheres in relationship to deep politics and the origins of specific deep events, such as this is a bungling that McCoy is claiming, or that if there's an OKC to happen during the Biden years, that it'll be similar to the first OKC bombing, some kind of disgruntled army vet rather than an actual deep state event, and so these are some of these areas where this is also an area where we filled in the void in the Trump years in terms of still being the only people on the internet to have done some kind of analysis of the continuity of agenda in relationship from 9/11 to 11/9. Okay. So back to this article. So I just wanted to note some of these weaknesses of this approach. We're not saying that, okay, let's just sort of get in bed with this angle. No, we're just saying this angle has been totally undeveloped in relationship to the actual assessment of what the 11/9 Trump attack on America actually was.
And in many cases, as flawed as it is in some areas, and this is the case for pretty much like a lot of these people that we've been talking about and describing, whether it be Seth Abramson or whoever, or Sarah Kenzie or whoever else we name, Craig Unger, is that we don't come at this as flawed as it might be, and there are areas where there are areas concerned with all their respective work that we don't agree with or see eye to eye on, to say the least, but. You know what, though? They're filling in the voids that our, quote, alternative media, truth media, is supposed to be filling in, but has abdicated the responsibility on. So
there you go. All right, back to the article. While America...
on these matters where they are correct, on these very important matters where they do, by and large, get it correct. So.
And the thing is that you get the sense these are real Americans. These are real Americans. Whatever you think of Seth Abramson, Sarah Kenzie, or Craig Unger, Alfred McCoy, these are real Americans. Okay. Back to the article, quote, while smaller nations like New Zealand, South Korea, and even impoverished Rwanda effectively curbed COVID-19, by the end of Trump's term, the U.S. already had experienced more than 400,000 deaths and 24 million infections, significantly above any other developed nation and a full quarter of the world's total cases. Okay, and aside, this, of course, is just one other angle that virtually the entirety of the alternative media got wrong got wrong at best. That's a good faith interpretation. That's like bungled. That's my version of bungled, so that it's likely worse than that, than got wrong over the key time of when we needed civil leadership. And one thing to keep an eye on around the Biden administration response here is going to be whether or not there is a rise of the use of presidential powers and the Defense Production Act in relationship to antigen rapid testing, voluntary home-based rapid testing, which is really one of the only ways to truly actually potentially contain the virus, and is also an alternative to what's already being pushed by the Biden aspects of the Biden administration, which has to do with what they call rapid testing, which is just PCR tests at home that then link into smartphone apps and obviously sort of biological health surveillance kind of stuff. No, we need simple, cheap, rapid antigen testing. Go look at the Michael Mina out of Harvard in terms of his proposals. And so he has some input into the Biden administration, and he says that they are getting their feet. So we will see what happens here. And so keep your eye on that as an indicator of whether the COVID perps are running the operation behind the scenes in terms of the ongoing American response, i.e. Biden administration response, or whether there is an actual new chapter here for real beyond trust the plan of the vaccine rollout and just more, home-based smart PCR testing. Okay. All right. Back to the article. Quote, meanwhile, Beijing mobilized a rigorous public health campaign that quickly contained the virus to just 4,600 deaths in a population of 1.4 billion. In only 4 months, China virtually eliminated the virus despite periodic new local breakouts and had its economy humming along with a 5% increase in gross domestic product, which accounted for 30% of global growth last year. Meanwhile, after 11 months of an incessant pandemic, the U.S. remained mired in a crippling recession. This striking disparity in state performance only accelerated China's quest to surpass the U.S. as the world's largest economy, and with all that financial clout, become its preeminent power.
I think this is very important because what you see here is you can get a basis for a justification. One of the things everybody in the media wants to talk about, like the consequences of extended lockdowns and all of that. And I will say, though, I think a lot of this goes back to not having an effective response to this in the first place. And so the consequences that come from not being able to effectively respond, which seems to be certainly a hallmark of the Trump administration, and as almost as a deliberate reaction or misreaction to this crisis. And so as a result of that, these things whereas these other countries have managed to, in ways the U.S. hasn't, gotten their act together, so that a country like China that's looking to supersede and surpass the U.S. Certainly, there's very happy about this state of crisis as a result to the bungled reaction, mismanaged
quote unquote
reaction,
American failure or bungling, so called.
Yes. But I mean, that's music to the ears of those who want to displace the American global presence in terms, economically and otherwise.
And again, the actual rational American response would have been neither Trump, enabled by the so-called alternative media, and it's just the flu, bro, and masks are slavery, and all of that kind of, or doesn't exist. You haven't isolated the virus, all of that kind of stuff that is still going on. Nor did it have to be the Chinese lockdown aspect of hammering people into their apartments. No, it could have been an actual indigenous American response, which to me at this point is still obviously a 4-point plan. You get the rapid antigen testing, totally voluntary. Send them, use the post office for all of this. The constitutionally proclaimed post office that the Trump regime tried to destroy using DeJoy and all of that. It was Trump post office sedition. You use the post office to help do most of this, really. You get the rapid antigen testing kits, totally voluntary to anybody interested. You use the Defense Production Act to create effective N95s for people who want to go out and be inside where those kind of masks are most helpful. You do vitamin D publicly funded, especially sent out to the most vulnerable populations in the United States. This, I believe, is a key piece of why this virus has continued to strike the people of color and most especially African-American community. But even you're seeing the rise in Los Angeles of the death rates of people of indigenous origins going up 1,000% and being hit super hard. And part of it is economic, yes, in terms of the working class and in Los Angeles context, is a lot of indigenous background. But in terms of the death rates, I believe it actually has a lot to do with vitamin D. And so you send all of that out via post office, totally funded. Then you basically decriminalize the alternative approaches, ivermectin, the zinc ionophores, and you allow people to decide with their own doctors or their own selves about how they want to protect themselves from the virus. But if you just, that's a fully voluntary American approach, an indigenous American approach that would work to actually help end the pandemic, and that would look totally different than a Chinese response, and would be actually much more effective in terms of the longer term, in terms of other pandemics and all of that. And then, of course, what's missing in all of this is the origins of the virus itself, the actual investigation into this newest 311, the origins of the apparently lab-made virus itself. Okay. Back to the article, quote, a tragic comic encore. It was, however, President Trump's bid for an encore that would prove truly extraordinary when it came to imperial decline. During its 70 years as a global hegemon, Washington's public promotion of democracy has been the signature program that has helped legitimate its global leadership. No matter the CIA-style interventions it launched or the colonial-style wars it continually fought.
And as an aside on that, that is where the constant, that's why the major hallmark of the criticism of of the U.S. empire, especially from the quote unquote anti-imperialist left, but also from aspects of this right, pseudo MAGA Steve Bannon type of criticism of the neocons as if they're actually ideologically opposed to the excesses of the war on terror in any way, shape, or form, is this undermining of this global leadership that, for all of its flaws in all of its issues, and there's so many issues to it. I mean, as we said, once again, we could talk all day about how the problems with American, quote, global leadership brought us to the moment that we're in now. But for all of its flaws, it was, it has been legitimized. And also I would add that if we'll have to go back, we'll have to have a serious conversation about this at some point, that not every aspect of American global leadership is always destructive or worst case possible scenario as well. So there has been a full-fledged across the spectrum attack on every aspect of Americanism and anything that points to this global leadership, which for all of its flaws, has been legitimized and is not always it's not in every single occurrence the worst scenario, the worst thing in the world either. So it's very interesting how it's importance of nuance, where we need to be able to have actual nuanced discussions about some of the merits of these things that are never heard in these conversations, or by your typical rah American apologists in terms of the false system, the false idea of Americana, that the liberal, quote unquote, liberal establishment, of the lionizing of the post-war order and all of the great victories that have been achieved for America, for the for the oppressed peoples, both of the world and within its own population, both of which you pull the mask off of those are much more myth than actual fact. It seems like at the end of the day. So, but there has been this assault all around, like on the American system in every aspect, and that was much needed to bring in somebody like a Donald Trump in the and what ultimately resulted from it. So,
and this is our recognized, and this is our open bias in terms of the antidote. We are American patriots of conscience of some sort here, and in order to exemplify that means that we both are nuanced in relationship to our criticism of our own country and our government, but it also means that we're fair in terms of of what we want to protect, what we want to resurrect, what we want to exemplify about the best of our country's traditions, both here at home and abroad. And that's what I would say. That's what it takes to be an actual real patriot, is to go to the depths across a full spectrum patriotism in many ways that is depth based and doesn't try to hide from any of these kinds of things, whether they're termed to be positive or negative.
And foreboding, the first part of the first sentence of the next paragraph is a major microcosm of the problems with like the American global leadership as it relates to the Cold War. So if you're ready to continue, we'll.
All right. So this is the final paragraph final section of this article, While America Was Sleeping, by Alfred McCoy. All right. Quote, while the Cold War often compromised that commitment in particularly striking ways, following its end, Washington has spent 30 years officially promoting fair voting and democratic transitions, with leaders like former President Jimmy Carter flying off to capitals on 5 continents to oversee and encourage free elections.
And by the way, I'm sure people will come up with issues like surrounding like the U.S.'s commitment to, quote, free and fair elections. Okay, fair enough. But also like in a world where the alternative to like the American criticism of free and fair elections is like the types like, Paul Manafort type operatives going around the world. It's like, really, so what's that's where you're kind of coming from, like whatever issues there are with like the American, insertion into like other countries' elections. Then you also have like at the very least, the flip and counter of that is also not an idealistic scenario, to say the least. So.
Okay, quote, suddenly the world watched in slack-jawed amazement as, on January 6th on the White House ellipse, the president denounced a fair American election. Okay. Okay, we'll put that aside for now because, and of course, everyone's going to say this is the most corrupt election ever from the Trump side. I sort of think that there was actually probably unrooted out election fraud that benefited both Trump and the down ballot Republicans. But what we can all agree upon is that we want to exemplify the fair American election. Actually, if you look at my We the People platform, the 7 planks of it are, number 1, clean and fair elections, okay? Number 2, sound and honest money. Number 3, just and simple taxes. 4, abundant and creative economics. 5, healed and rejuvenated ecologies. 6, real and mutual security. And 7, restored and reinvigorated rights. Sorry about it's in the wall behind me. I had to go look at it real quick. I need to get that down. So that is the thing, is that at the very least, it is an archetype that we want to reach for. And all smart political people at this point are focusing on how can we actually establish fair and honest elections by reestablishing hand-cast, hand-counted ballots, which no one of good faith at this point can deny needs to happen. So, all right, putting that aside, just a fair American election. Come on, McCoy. It's like whatever. Okay. Quote, all right. On January 6th on the White House ellipse, the president denounced a fair American election as fraudulent and sent a mob of 10,000 white nationalists, QAnon conspirators, and other Trumpsters off to storm the Capitol, where Congress was ratifying the transition to a new administration. Adding to this failed state aura, the country's once formidable national security apparatus crumpled like a third world constabulary as right-wing militiamen breached the frail security cordon around the Capitol and stormed its halls as if they were a lynch mob hunting for congressional leaders.
What about Antifa?
House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer's desperate calls to a dawdling Pentagon and Maryland Governor Larry Hogan's dangerously delayed mobilization of his state's National Guard, caused by the U.S. military's compromised chain of command, only seem to echo the sort of tropical coup scenarios I witnessed in Manila, the capital of the Philippines during the 1980s. When Congress was finally back in session, the Capitol still rang with Republican calls in the name of national unity for forgetting what the president had incited. In that way, Republican congressional representatives seemed to echo the kind of impunity that has long protected fallen military juntas in Asia or Latin America from any accounting for their countless crimes. This attempt, in other words, to perpetuate a would-be autocrat's power through a failed coup was the sort of spectacle that many millions living in Asia, Africa, and Latin America have experienced in their own fragile states, but never expected to see in America. Suddenly, our supposedly exceptional nation seemed tragically ordinary.
This is that, Jeremy, I didn't realize this at the time, but we were talking in like November, December about like the scenarios you couldn't foresee happening here. I didn't realize that this was precisely going to be what I was talking about, that it did look that, and like, it can't happen here. And once it does happen here, it's just like people still quite don't know how to react to seeing it happen here, because it's the one thing nobody ever expects is to see like America's going to end up like that.
Yeah.
Or could end
and
up
so
like
I'm
that.
actually happy that you sort of got it exactly right in that case. That we actually didn't see the worst case scenario of the horror movie of we would never see this in our country, but more like the imagery of the quote unquote third world came home to roost in certain ways. And it doesn't mean that a worst case scenario could not have happened. It looks like a worst case scenario was in the works, but the worst case scenario ended up not happening. But meanwhile, the analysis that we pursued, the areas of inquiry since the election on November 3rd, turned out to be highly accurate about where we wanted to keep our attention on and what might ultimately happen. And I'm happy that we did not encounter the worst case scenario.
And that's why that's why we're so adamant about like accountability, whatever that ultimately means or represents. Something has to be done to and maybe someone, maybe our friend John Briston is right, and to be concerned that like there is going to be no effort for accountability, and that it's all just like a pipe dream. Maybe he's right, but still at some level or another, like I believe that like this, and I do think that there are serious people within our system who do want some semblance of accountability for what has been done and for this operation that has taken place. And it's absolutely vital that this has to, and this can be done without waging a war on 75 million Americans that like Tucker Carlson and Tulsi Gabbard and Glenn Greenwald are desperate to get like people to believe that like any type of like even timid calls for something resembling accountability is like a declaration of war against a third of the country's population. It can be done without doing that. And it's simply, a big part of it just entails being honest about some of the things that went on. And that would also require a lot of people to do a combination of eat humble pie and look at their own, perhaps the failures of their own institutions or the media or other offices that they've been affiliated with, to really give the truth to the people as it should have been done. But I mean, it's absolutely imperative that like for all the issues with our system, it's absolutely imperative that like this operation needs to get rooted out, because it's going to come back, and it'll come back worse than it did. And that's so. And
of course, the actual responsibility of real Americans and independent analysts is to take account of the levels and the depths of the hybrid warfare operation that created a seditious aspect, a rising seditious aspect, if not worse than that, so that there could be the situation we're talking about, the threats of domestic terrorism and all of that could even become a conversation. So we need to do that kind of work and take account for why people were taken in by this Trump operation, why people decided to sort of slow roll or limit the inquiry into the depths of it, and then ultimately sort of play the role sometimes that the Russian state media most obviously plays, which is total whataboutism war. Which, and as you pointed out with these certain characters, such as Greenwald, Gabbard, and they're all, Carlson, they're replete throughout this sort of smaller alternative media too, that somehow a question about the rioters on January 6th and some of the networks that back them and all of that somehow is then going to threaten the lives of 75 million Trump voters. That's not the deal. That's actually sort of like low level, communicatory terrorism to some extent, to try to sort of spread through Fox News that the average American Trump voter is now going to be hunted down by the Department of Homeland Security and either killed or put in a gulag.
But it's also what's unfortunately happening is this is an exploitation of the areas where with the failure to be honest about the nature of this from those who are supposed to be watching and supposed to be guarding against Trump, which obviously I think a lot of these institutions. So in some cases, maybe unintentionally, but in other cases, CNN completely failed intentionally failed, or completely intentionally. It was an intentional failure and in that regard, though, it's preying upon that. And the answer to this is actual accountability and honesty about the nature of what caused and what created this, because and maybe it's just destined not to happen under a Biden administration, but at the very least, we still need to be having a conversation regardless. Serious-minded people of conscience need to be having conversations in that direction. And that's the answer to this idea of anything is going to be collective warfare on is to let the population know, no, this is not targeted at you per se, and unfortunately a lot of the optics that you're seeing in the way people continue to talk is unfortunately not giving you much faith that it's going in that direction. But still, at the very least, we can, those of us who understand these dynamics can be out there having and helping to lead and steer conversations that would lead into these directions.
The answer to the justice for 11/9 is the truth of 9/11. That's it. Okay.
Yeah. That's true. Right. It's true.
All right. So back to this article, While America Was Sleeping, by Alfred McCoy. When Congress was finally back in session, the Capitol still rang with Republican calls in the name of national unity for forgetting what the president had incited. In that way, Republican congressional representatives seem to echo the kind of impunity that has long protected fallen military juntas in Asia or Latin America from any accounting for their countless crimes. This attempt, in other words, to perpetuate a would-be autocrat's power through a failed coup was the sort of spectacle that many millions living in Asia, Africa, and Latin America have experienced in their own fragile states, but never expected to see in America. Suddenly, our supposedly exceptional nation seemed tragically ordinary. I think I'd already read that other part, huh? The shimmering dome of the Capitol.
Worth reading again.
Yeah, it is. The shimmering dome of the Capitol once symbolized the vitality of this nation's democracy, inspiring others to follow its principles or at least acquiesce to its power. It's a good phrase there. Okay. This country now looks tattered and tired, caught like others before it, between forgetting in the name of unity or demanding the powerful be held accountable for high crimes that will otherwise haunt the nation. Instead of aspiring to America's ideals or entrusting their security to its power, many nations will likely find their own way forward, cutting deals with all comers, starting with China. Despite an aura of overwhelming strength, empires, even ones as powerful as America's, often prove surprisingly fragile, and their decline regularly comes far sooner than anyone could have imagined, particularly when the cause is not Thomas Cole's quote-unquote savage enemy, but their own self-destructive instincts. Today, in the era of a 78-year-old president, a veritable Rip Van Biden, Americans and the rest of the world are, it seems, waking up in a new age. It could well be a daunting one. And I just want to point out, that's the end of the article, but I want to point out that second to last paragraph there where he says it's not the Thomas Cole's savage enemy, but their own self-destructive instincts is one of the reasons why we wanted to actually read this whole article and analyze it, because this article actually shows evidence of the involvement of an actual attack on the United States in relationship to Trump that took advantage or utilized our self-destructive instincts and our weak points, our domestic weak points, and our moral our moral turpitude in order to then attack it. And so I think it's interesting to read this as a piece of evidence in a much larger and much maybe deeper political perspective that we have in relationship to the planned aspects of all of this that we've been uncovering. And once again, I think it just shows that there's a value to being able to be open to different perspectives that can bring in key pieces of missing grammar, i.e. factual data, that we then have the logical background to be able to begin to put into its proper place to understand then what it really means. And it does not mean with this payoff, this sort of like payoff, whether it's the analysis of McCoy that this was not the quote unquote savage enemy, but just their own self-destructive instincts. And that also there's a sort of like despair, reminds me of Chris Hedges wringing his hands in terms of the last days of the American empire, rather than a committed moral outlook that says, what are we as Americans, we the American people, going to do to take responsibility for our situation, for our government, for ourselves, for our role in the world, for our role at home here, and so this is I think the big payoff here is not a big payoff in terms of McCoy. The big payoff he gives us is a bit of the background data that was missing, that is key. And then finally, before I turn it over to you, Greg, to begin to wrap us up here, I just want to point that some of the background of McCoy's statements about the difference in the Chinese response and the American response is based on a World Economic League table that was put out in the end of December. There's a Reuters article published on Christmas Day titled "China to Leapfrog U.S. as World's Biggest Economy by 2028, Think Tank." And then it's from the Center for Economics and Business Research. And then it says, quote, "The COVID-19 pandemic and corresponding economic fallout have certainly tipped this rivalry in China's favor," unquote. The CEBR said China's, quote, "skillful management of the pandemic," unquote, with its strict early lockdown and hits to long-term growth in the West, meant China's relatively economic performance had improved. Looking back down here, the report basically says that China has moved itself forward by 5 full years in terms of when it will transcend the United States as the globe's economic leader. And that's based totally on the quote-unquote bungled response of the Trump regime to the COVID lab virus in the United States. So
this begs the question for me, and I'm playing off of some of like our esteemed, some not so esteemed colleagues in the quote unquote alternative media. Is it xenophobic to talk about China supplanting the U.S. and does that mean you want to start a war with China and it's completely untrue and fabricated, or is it true and we're supposed to embrace it? I mean, which one is it? Or is the answer somewhere in the middle? I'd like to think the answer is somewhere outside of both of those two scenarios.
Exactly, and it obviously is. Okay, so this is we'll link to both the original report and the article about this. But in the report, it says, quote, this is forecasts under the Chinese section of the World Economic League tables 2021. Quote, The skillful management of the pandemic and the hits to long-term growth in the West mean that China's relative economic performance has improved. We now think that the Chinese economy in dollar terms will overtake the U.S. economy in 2028, a full 5 years earlier than we thought last year, unquote. Okay. And so you put that in context of all these other things that McCoy pointed out in terms of the actual Trump, quote unquote, bungling of the trade war with China. And you begin to see, as I was always pointing out when we would talk about the Steele dossier, that if you actually read the Steele dossier, it said itself that the elements of the Trump campaign were happy to embrace the question about the Russian connections because it then avoided the much deeper compromise in relationship to other potential countries, including China. And we would also then add in Israel to all of that. And then maybe we would add in the relationship between China and Israel, no matter how China might vote in relationship to Israel at the UN.
Exactly. So I guess, yeah, we'll start to wrap up here. And I mean, this article, it's not a perfect article by any stretch, as we talked about, and we push back against aspects of it. But I mean, this is the best summarization of, particularly with relation to the, the consequences of like the China policy and the best assessment I've seen in breakdown.
China policy?
No, I said Trump. I said Trump. I maybe it sounded like Trump, but I meant to say it. I said Trump. Maybe it sounded like that. Maybe I accidentally had a Freudian slip and said Trump China policy, which it is a Trump policy. But certainly that would have been at the very least like a Freudian slip of the tongue. The Trump China policy and the consequences of it, and versus like what it was said it was going to accomplish versus what it actually appears to have accomplished. And it's very interesting. I once again go back to this because with the relation to like the end of the article and like the rest of the world and stunned that like America's come to this, like at the very least, even the people who had been under like the boot of America and understand like the worst excesses of like the American, you never see something like this happening here. And ultimately, once again, it brings us back to like, it can't happen here. And like, the entire basis of conspiracy culture, this largely right-wing conservative bent with the conspiracy culture has been building around. I mean, obviously you can go back to the 1960s, John Birch Society, Cold War era, but especially with like the rise of Alex Jones over the last 2 decades, the idea that the imminent tyranny is coming to you courtesy of like these liberal communist globalists. And when Bush is in power, communist globalists, right? That the impending, the FEMA camps and the impending mass tyranny and enslavement of America is coming at any minute, and we must be prepared for it somehow. Meanwhile, what that causes you to do is to have absolutely no preparation, like because you're just completely like, it's damn near impossible to like follow Alex Jones or some of these other people and like these alarmist types and have like any type of like actual anything even resembling clarity in terms of like potential threats that you could face, because it's all blown like so badly out of proportion, largely by design with the Alex Jones operation, that ultimately the same things that the Alex Joneses and other people have been warning us was going to happen. And it finally, I think the closest we've seen yet to that something like that actually rearing its ugly head here just happened. And not only did it happen, but it was cheerleaded upon by the same people and brought to us by the same people who spent so much time over the past decades warning us that it was going to come, and then when it comes, they cheerlead and help spearhead it.
Yes, and then so I guess what's missing here, I would just say that any serious analyst and media commentator has to digest these factual aspects of what Trump actually did in relationship to the United States. In order to be taken seriously in this post-Trump era. At the same time, we still have more work to do here in terms of then digesting the U.S.-Russian policy dynamics, which we will get into at a later time. But there are some interesting, and again, the issue here is much longer term back than just Trump. But then Trump articulates some escalation or the heightened moment of this longer term aspect. And, and this is a little bit more complicated to tease out because it has to do with what on the surface looks like a harshness against Russia. But I guess that's exactly the same as that he's tough on the China deal too. And so that this is all basically just under the surface of the rhetoric, of the Trump rhetoric, there's something a much bigger geopolitical strategy being pursued in relationship to the Trump hybrid warfare weapon by these big powers like China and Russia.
And it's just a matter of like, I think there's still some dots and connections to fill in, blanks to fill in. But for the cursory glance at like U.S. policy, like towards Russia, at the very least from like what we've described as like this multipolar push of like the weakening and lessening of American influence globally, whether it's regards what we just talked about with China and the economic decline of America on a global scale, or it's with relation to U.S. Combination of military and diplomatic leadership on global scale for all of its obvious flaws and issues being supplanted. And that's a major part of the Trump operation was especially, we saw that most obviously in terms of the Middle East, the American, the vacuum of like the traditional American power broker with Trump ultimately in the process of doing that, Trump just finalizes the complete American shifting to like the everything that like the actual like hardline epitomization of like the worst extremes of the Zionist project always wanted in terms of in terms of the region, but then also militarily leaving this vacuum that's ultimately filled in by Russia and I think also China and some global mishmash of maybe Wagner, Yevgeny Prigozhin and Eric Prince combination of like unaccounted for global private mercenary armies. And so we can see like where the consequences of this have been, everything from like U.S. policy in Syria and other places to from that perspective. And even in terms of the enabling and the fulfilling of, I believe, both Russian and Israeli goals as far as Europe goes and the rise of the pseudo-populist movement and the undermining of European leadership in the same way that American global leadership has been undermined. I think we could already see like the consequences of this and how it benefited like a Russian geopolitical ambitions and goals. And I think there's still some areas to fill in terms of like what we're describing here with like aspects of nuclear policy. But I think over the next few years, I'm pretty confident we'll have more information to fill in and perhaps start to lead in the direction of a definitive answer in that regard as well. But at the very least, you can see where you can take like a look at what the trends that have been in place, and it's that you can see where the benefits have been for this multipolar shifting and where the decreased U.S. Global presence is a benefit and a boon to these interests.
Yes, and just the shorthand of this that we will be looking at will be something like in a similar way where the economic warfare between Trump's America and Xi Jinping's China was actually, a handout to the Chinese, or some kind of losing chess move, some kind of 1D chess loser move in relationship to the Chinese. We might see a similar kind of thing in terms of the geopolitics and these nuclear policy and these agreements in relationship to that there might be some longer term aspect to this. There's an article titled "Putin Says Russia Had to Create Hypersonic Weapons After U.S. Pullout from ABM Treaty, Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty." This is in almasdarnews.com. And it was in the wake of 9/11, actually, that the George W. Bush administration pulled out of the ABM treaty. And so that's what we're talking about. There's some longer term stuff going on here that then needs to be understood in relationship now to the Trump attempt at the capstone of the hybrid warfare operation. And then finally, so there's these two phrases that we're beginning to look into that we see as instrumental to helping cover up truth, basic truth and accountability in relationship to at home and abroad. And at home, it's the threat of civil war. It's like what Tulsi Gabbard said, I didn't vote for impeachment because it'll lead to civil war. And it's similar to what we talked about before, about how any talk of investigation into the Trump sedition operation, January 6th, or the deeper background of the hybrid warfare 11/9 operation is somehow going to criminalize in a deathly fashion 75 million Americans, which would obviously lead to some kind of civil war of some sort. That's not the case. Those are rhetorical, informational warfare phrases that I seem to associate with a Russian sort of sphere dynamic. You can't have truth and accountability at home, or because civil war. And then if you can't have truth and accountability around any foreign, actors in relationship to that, or international actors abroad in relationship to any of this, because World War III. And I would just point out that, the Biden administration already basically re-upped I believe it's the new SALT nuclear treaty, strategic arms, something treaty with the Russians, while also saying we are going to be looking into and taking into account and working to prevent such things as what was hinted at as what we would call the 11/9 operation, or Trump-Russia election operations, and also in relationship to cyber attacks and solar winds and all of that. And so, as we pointed out, the actual approach is diplomacy, an actual American strength to be able to create diplomacy when it's needed, while also then saying we're not going to cover all this up, which was obviously the Trump administration's whole thing, was covering up the role of these foreign entities and helping them come into power. But we'll have to leave the deeper look at those kind of warfare phrases of you can't have truth and accountability at home because civil war, and you can't have truth and accountability abroad because World War III. Not true. Those are just pure rhetorical warfare phrases that are meant to stop your thought process and work towards truth and accountability.
And I'll even add one more thing on that. And this will be something else that'll have to be hashed out in the future. Is I understand the very real concerns, and we share these very real concerns of the overreaches in terms of the domestic response to the aftermath of the Trump era. And I understand there's many reasons for concern. We've been adamant about those. Like we are very concerned about like the what appears to be perhaps a greasing of the skids, or quote unquote lone wolf terror attacks taking place. I mean, those are all very real concerns, and people have very real concern about aspects of. But also it's very important that still, even with the concerns that are out there of like overreaches by the government, that we're still able to. I'd say at the very least, a balancing act is needed between between the very real concerns, and then also understanding there are a lot of people out there that are going to, from both the domestic perspective and from the foreign policy perspective, are going to do everything in their power to undermine anything that's even the most timid attempts at any rhetorical semblance of accountability as either the direct manifestation of a declaration of domestic war against a third of the country's population, or the equivalent or the implementation of a hostile, the desire to start a war, say with a country like Russia. And I mean, it's and the excesses are absurd. And the fact is, our concerns about whatever overreaches could be there or may not take place cannot lead, and I don't think can distract us from the need for that term, the all important term, accountability, and ensuring at least, even if the government's not going to take its responsibility seriously in this regard, rhetorically, and in terms of having these oral conversations on the record, helping to lead and steer and be part of a conversation that actually of actual like-minded people who understand
or not like-minded people. That's actually most important. Yeah.
Well, but yes, but there is
maybe principled people. Something like
yes.
Truth and accountability is important. That's no matter where it leads.
Point.
Yeah,
that's a great point. I like that term, principled. Principled people who understand the excesses and the depths of this operation, and that understand the difference also between actual accountability versus an actual collective punishment of Americans, and also I think have at least some semblance. And there's some areas where there may not be this understanding of this said balance between the overreaches of the the hand of the worst elements of like the domestic response versus actual accountability. And so it's the areas I like that term, like principled people of to have these conversations with, who at the very least understand that like there needs to be some serious accountability for what has happened and what can and will continue to take place, combined with the balancing between that and also the concerns about the domestic response and overreach is not distracting us from like still what needs to be done.
No, and as we've continued to say, we still need to push for truth and accountability for 9/11, which is going to become crucial, even more crucial than it has been this whole time. And so we got to continue then push for truth and accountability around 11/9. And not be in denial about it. And that will be the best way to actually deal, I think, with the threats of domestic escalation in terms of the dangers of these extremes you name, Greg, is by pointing to the true origins and the high level origins of these things, and not to the lower level patsies that are usually the ones that are then pushed under the bus.
And also a serious, even like a serious intellectual like understanding of the depths of some of these of this, and it goes far beyond Trump, and it also reflects upon our own system in so many ways in addition to Trump, is that ultimately like serious understandings of like the nature of like the Trump operation and the long-term and short-term aspects of it, both domestically and internationally, will lead you into directions. This is why I feel like it's so important for us to lead the way in what I've described as like a destigmatizing of events such as September 11th and, the nature of like false flag, conspiracy culture, the destigmatizing of these things that I think have been very much negatively and largely by design in a lot of circles, negatively used and weaponized, is that ultimately like if you start to really peel down and get into the depths of like of like Trump and even, outside of Trump, long term and short term in the history, you will start to get into some like very, very, very uncomfortable but very real truths about things like September 11th and the nature of like the pseudo global nature of the state of warfare we found ourselves in, and so many other things as well. So like ultimately, like accountability for Trump, ultimately, if we took it to where it needed to go, it would lead to accountability to the excesses of the crimes of the Bush administration, for example, among other things. And that's why I feel like this can be done. Like if we can have like destigmatization, maybe it's a pipe dream, but I also feel like it's a realistic endeavor in some aspects. If we can have this, then we can, like people who otherwise would not be open to things like the nature of conspiracy, the realities of some of the aspects of conspiracy culture of false flag, state crimes against democracy, as I believe it was put by Lance DeHaven Smith, the academic, that you can have some real awakenings to some of these realities if we can get it out of the hands of the people that have negatively weaponized it for so long, and so many cases at the epicenter of bringing what just happened under Trump, making it a reality. Then there can be some significant progress made, and that's why it's got to even go beyond even what like the Biden administration's reaction per se is, and how serious they are about like actual accountability versus the whole look forward not backward mentality. The Obama administration is even beyond that. Like it's so important because it can lead to a lot of positive things, really unpeeling the layers of of short-term and long-term aspects that led to all this from a domestic and on a global scale, can lead to some serious understandings from, I think, a good portion, or at least a small but very serious base of independent researchers, people who are within certain within the fan bases and who follow a lot of the more influential researchers out there. People there can be serious positive strides made in these directions by accountability, and it even just goes so far beyond just Donald Trump per se, or even 2016.
All right, until next time, Antidote, we out.
Okay, thank you.